I'm going to show you a couple ways to weave in your ends with your knitting projects. I usually use just one or two methods of weaving in your ends. And the quickest way to weave in your ends is to put your yarn tail onto a tapestry needle, and I just whip stitch the ends into the wrong side of the fabric like this. So whenever I break my yarn, I leave a tail of yarn about this long so that there's enough yarn to weave in. And this is my number one way of weaving in ends. I go into the purl bumps on the wrong side, and I usually go into 8 to 10 stitches, and that's enough to keep the yarn in place. It doesn't really matter if you're going into the same color as your working yarn or a contrast color. For me, it doesn't really show or matter, but if you want to be extra safe, you could go into the purl bumps that are the same color as your little tail of yarn. But I'm going into these contrast color bumps right here, and I've done enough. I've done about 8 or 9 stitches now, and that's enough to keep it into place. But I'm going to do a few extras just to be safe, and that's enough. So there's enough length. If you have like about 2 inches or so, which is about 5 centimeters, that's going to keep the yarn in place. And when you snip your yarn tail, don't snip it too close to the fabric. Snip it like right here. So that gives you a little bit of flexibility for the fabric to stretch and without that tail poking to the front. One more thing I consider when I'm weaving in my ends like that is if it's a project in the round, I take a look at where the beginning of my round is. So like right here, the beginning of my round was right here, and this yellow strand of yarn is over here. So whenever I weave in my ends, I want to cross the beginning of the round location. So if the beginning of the round was right here, and my yarn tail is on this side of it, I want it to travel to the other side so that you don't get a big hole. I'm going to do that with this yellow strand. And I'm just going to start whip stitching my tail. And another quick way to do this is you can go through several stitches at the same time. So whip that needle into the wrong side of your fabric. And you can go into several stitches and then pull that tapestry needle through. That's enough to keep it into place, but you can always do a couple extra. That's enough for me. And then trim it not too close to the fabric, and that'll do it. I'm going to show you one more method of quickly weaving in your ends. If you don't weave in your ends, you're going to have a lot of tails at the end of your project, so I definitely recommend to do this as you go. Like knit a couple sections and then weave in a few ends. Knit the next couple sections and weave them in so you don't leave all of those tails to the end of your project. Okay, here's one. This is some garter stitch, and another way to weave in your ends is to follow the path of a stitch. So it might be tricky to see, but I'm following the path of a strand of yarn, and I'm just duplicating that path. So I see this green strand going down, and then that green strand is going down here. This one takes a little bit more detail, and it takes a little bit longer. So I don't do this method, but it does look really nice because you're just following the path of a stitch. Where does that strand go? It's going through there. And that's going to look kind of more invisible on the wrong side. But especially for projects in the round, and even for my shawls, I don't care if we see that little horizontal ladder, that horizontal strand of yarn. If this bothers you, then try duplicating the path of a stitch. But if it doesn't bother you, then just do this quick whip stitch. Eight or 10 stitches is usually enough. All right, that's enough for me. So I'm going to snip that not too close to the fabric. And especially if you weave in the ends before you block a project, you don't want to snip the ends too close, because then they'll pop through to the right side and then it might get a little too short. So if you haven't blocked your project yet, then snip your yarn tails with a little bit more space, not too close to the fabric, and it should be just fine. And it gives you plenty of room to block, and this is what it looks like on the wrong side. I did that whip stitch for all of these yarn tails, and sometimes I'm really lazy and I'll take 2 or 3 strands of yarn together, 2 or 3 tails, and whip stitch them all together into the wrong side. It gets a little more bulky, but I'm not going to look at the inside of my socks. I'm just proud that I knit socks in the first place, so it can look like that. And if you want it to look super even and not too bulky, then just take 1 strand of yarn at a time. And maybe take that coral one here, and that gold one can go there, so you can space them out and weave them into different rows on the wrong side. And the right side, how is that going to look? Beautiful. So we worked in all of those ends. If you don't like weaving in ends, then check out the link below. I linked to my Weave-In Steven, and there's a method of weaving in your ends as you go, as you knit, where you don't even need a tapestry needle. So if you're really lazy and you really love shortcuts, then check out that Weave-In Steven technique, and you don't have to do any sewing, any weaving in of your ends. It's a way of trapping the yarn tails as you knit. So definitely check out that video, and you can mix and match the Weave-In Steven with this whip stitch way of weaving in your ends. So that's the way I like to do it. There's all kinds of other ways to weave in your ends, so experiment and try different techniques, but those are my favorites for my Westknits projects. And if you like this technique tutorial, then check out my other videos here on my channel, and you can subscribe as well to get updates on when I post new tutorials, new yarn features, new workshops in the woolly world of Westknits. So thanks for watching, and happy weaving in of your ends.